A mistake in the making, approximately 2,000 words. Officer Ryan Carter leaned back in his patrol car, staring at the sluggish traffic rolling through the crumbling streets of a lower-income neighborhood. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, highlighting the grit and wear of a place that had seen better days. His police radio crackled with idle chatter, but Ryan wasn't paying attention. Instead, he sipped his lukewarm coffee, his mind lost in a tangle of discontent. After 10 years on the force, the idealism that had propelled him into law enforcement was nothing more than a memory. Ryan had envisioned a career of heroism, breaking up drug rings, rescuing children, and keeping the streets safe. But the job wasn't like the action movies that had inspired him. It was paperwork, noise complaints, and endless traffic stops. Worse yet, he was stationed in a precinct struggling with strained resources and mounting public distrust. The controversies surrounding police bias had turned every action into a potential headline. Still, Ryan considered himself above it all. Sure, he thought, a few bad cops made it harder for the rest, but he wasn't like them. He was fair, decisive. He trusted his instincts. Yet, deep down, there were cracks in his certainty, unspoken doubts he refused to confront. His reliance on intuition, as he liked to call it, had begun to morph into something else. A quiet arrogance, coupled with subtle biases he refused to acknowledge. As he idly scanned the road ahead, a flash of red caught his eye. A sleek, gleaming Mercedes-Benz gliding down the street like an alien object in this worn-down landscape. Ryan leaned forward, his attention sharpening. It wasn't just the car's luxury that drew his gaze, but its driver, a middle-aged black man, casually dressed in a crisp white shirt and khaki slacks. The man seemed calm, almost serene, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Ryan's gut churned. Something doesn't add up, he thought. A car like that. Here, his internal radar flared with suspicion, though he couldn't articulate why. He muttered to himself, "Doesn't fit." His instinct, his finely tuned sense of reading situations, was never wrong. At least, that's what he told himself. He placed his coffee in the cup holder and flicked on the patrol lights. The sudden flash of red and blue broke the monotony of the street. Traffic parted, curious glances darting toward Ryan's car. The Mercedes slowed, its driver signaling calmly as it pulled over to the curb. Ryan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his pulse quickening. As he parked behind the car, he reached for his radio. "Carter to dispatch," he said, initiating a routine stop on a red Mercedes-Benz, license plate Victor 5829er. "Stand by." The dispatcher confirmed, but Ryan was already out of the car, his boots crunching on the asphalt as he approached the vehicle. The tinted window rolled down smoothly, revealing the driver's composed face. He met Ryan's gaze with a calm, steady expression that only deepened Ryan's unease. "Good evening, officer," the man said in a measured tone. "License and registration, please," Ryan replied curtly. The man nodded, his movements deliberate as he retrieved the requested documents. His actions were slow, almost exaggerated in their care. Ryan noted this with irritation. Too careful, he thought. He handed over the documents, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. The license read Joseph Malcolm, and the registration matched the car. Everything appeared legitimate, but instead of reassurance, Ryan felt a prickle of frustration. He wasn't ready to let this go. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to project authority. "What brings you to this area, Mr. Malcolm?" Ryan asked, his tone neutral but tinged with skepticism. Joseph's brow furrowed slightly, but his composure didn't waver. "I'm heading to a meeting downtown," he replied. "I stopped to check my GPS." Ryan arched an eyebrow. "A meeting? Here?" He gestured vaguely to the surrounding neighborhood, its cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. "Driving this?" Joseph's lips tightened into a thin line, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" Ryan ignored the question, retreating to his patrol car with the documents. His partner, Officer Laura Bennett, glanced up from the passenger seat. She was younger, newer to the force, and still carried a hint of idealism Ryan found exhausting. "Everything checks out," Laura said, glancing at the screen displaying Joseph's clean record. "No priors, no flags. Looks like a simple stop." Ryan grunted. "Run the plates anyway." Laura hesitated. "Ryan, we've got no reason." "Run them," he snapped. Laura bit her lip but complied, tapping the information into the database. Ryan stared at the Mercedes, his jaw clenched. The driver's calm demeanor gnawed at him, a quiet defiance he interpreted as arrogance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the car. Maybe it was the way Joseph looked at him, like he wasn't afraid. The radio crackled. "Plate is clean. Registered to Joseph Malcolm. No warrants or suspicious activity." Laura glanced at Ryan. "You satisfied now?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, approaching the Mercedes once more. Joseph watched him, his face unreadable but calm. "Step out of the vehicle," Ryan ordered. Joseph blinked, his expression betraying mild surprise. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" "Step out of the vehicle," Ryan repeated, his voice harder. Joseph hesitated but eventually complied, opening the door and stepping onto the curb. He stood tall, his posture straight but non-threatening. Ryan motioned for him to raise his hands, which Joseph did without protest. As Ryan began a pat-down, he could feel Laura's eyes on him from the patrol car. He ignored her. Joseph's pockets were empty, his wallet the only item he carried. No weapons, no contraband. Nothing. "Is this really necessary?" Joseph asked, his voice tinged with the faintest edge of annoyance. Ryan stepped back, his frustration mounting. "You're free to go," he said finally, handing back the documents with an air of reluctance. Joseph took them without a word, his eyes meeting Ryan's with quiet intensity. "Thank you," he said, his voice polite but pointed. As Joseph returned to his car, Ryan felt a prickling sensation of unease. He had no reason to stop him. He knew it, and Joseph knew it. And as the Mercedes pulled away, Ryan's gaze followed it, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. "Unbelievable," Laura muttered as Ryan slid back into the patrol car. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. Laura shook her head, her face unreadable. "You know exactly what it means." For a moment, Ryan considered arguing. But he didn't. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as they pulled back onto the road. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that this encounter wasn't over. A stirring in the shadows, approximately 2,000 words. The red Mercedes-Benz coasted down the street, its polished exterior gleaming under the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside, Joseph Malcolm gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. The encounter with Officer Carter lingered in his mind, replaying like a tape on a loop. He had done everything right. Followed the law, complied with the officer's demands, maintained composure, but it hadn't mattered. The underlying implication of the stop was clear. His presence in that neighborhood, in that car, had been enough to raise suspicion. Joseph exhaled deeply, trying to push the frustration aside. He was used to this. After years of navigating a world where his success often drew more scrutiny than admiration, he had learned to weather these moments with grace. But tonight felt different. He glanced at his phone resting in the cup holder, its screen glowing softly with an incoming text. "Michelle, did you make it to the meeting yet?" He picked up the phone at the next red light, quickly typing a response. "Running late. I'll explain later." As the light turned green, Joseph accelerated, his thoughts still racing. Tonight's incident had been a small reminder of a much larger problem, one that he had spent years trying to address in his career. As the Attorney General for the state, Joseph had made it his mission to tackle systemic injustices, particularly those within the criminal justice system. He knew the statistics, how bias and prejudice seeped into every level of law enforcement. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it firsthand were two entirely different things. Joseph arrived at his destination, a modest community center tucked between rows of aging buildings. The fluorescent sign flickered overhead as he pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet conversation as a group of local leaders gathered around a long table. They were activists, educators, and advocates, people dedicated to driving change in their city. Joseph stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Despite his casual attire, his reputation preceded him. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "Sorry I'm late," he said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I had a situation on the way here." A woman sitting to his right, Angela Reyes, raised an eyebrow. Angela was a fierce advocate for criminal justice reform, known for her no-nonsense demeanor. "What kind of situation?" she asked. Joseph hesitated, debating how much to share. Finally, he said, "I was pulled over. No real reason, just a routine stop." The room erupted into murmurs. A man at the other end of the table, Marcus Lee, leaned forward. "You mean they racially profiled you?" he asked bluntly. Joseph met Marcus's gaze, his face unreadable. "Let's just say it's a reminder of why we're here tonight," he replied. "Let's get started." The group spent the next hour discussing their agenda, a community-led initiative to address racial disparities in policing. They talked about strategies for increasing accountability, training programs to combat bias, and the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Joseph listened intently, taking notes and offering insights when needed, but his mind kept drifting back to Officer Carter. After the meeting, as the attendees began to disperse, Angela lingered behind. She approached Joseph, her arms crossed. "That situation you mentioned earlier," she said, her tone careful but probing. "It's not the first time, is it?" Joseph sighed, leaning against the edge of the table. "No," he admitted, "and it probably won't be the last." Angela frowned. "You're the Attorney General, Joseph. If they're willing to profile you, imagine what's happening to people without your position, your resources." He nodded. "I know. That's why we're doing this work." "But is it enough?" she pressed. "What happened tonight? It's a story people need to hear, not just because of who you are, but because it shines a light on how pervasive this problem is." Joseph considered her words. He had always been cautious about sharing his personal experiences, wary of making himself the story. But Angela had a point. His platform could amplify the issue in a way few others could. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Angela gave him a pointed look but didn't push further. "Good, because this fight needs all the voices it can get." Later that night, Joseph sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating the room. He stared at the blank document on the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Angela's words echoed in his mind. Was it enough? He had spent his career crafting policies and pushing for reform, but the pace of change was slow, and the resistance was strong. Maybe it was time to take a different approach. He began to type, the words flowing hesitantly at first, then with increasing momentum. He described the encounter with Officer Carter, detailing every moment with painstaking clarity. But he didn't stop there. He wrote about the broader issue, the systemic biases that allowed incidents like this to happen every day. He wrote about the fear and frustration experienced by those who didn't have the privilege of a title or a platform to protect them. By the time he finished, the document was several pages long. He leaned back in his chair, rereading what he had written. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. For a moment, he considered deleting it, but instead, he saved the file and closed the laptop. The next step could wait until morning. Across town, Officer Ryan Carter sat in his own small apartment, nursing a beer and flipping aimlessly through TV channels. The encounter with Joseph Malcolm was still fresh in his mind, gnawing at him in a way he didn't fully understand. He had run dozens of stops like that before, trusting his instincts and brushing off any second guessing. But something about tonight felt different. He couldn't shake the look in Joseph's eyes. Calm, steady, but with an undercurrent of quiet defiance. It wasn't anger or fear, but something deeper, something that made Ryan feel exposed. For the first time, he found himself questioning whether his instincts were as reliable as he believed. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. It was a text from his partner, Laura. "Laura, you okay?" That stop tonight seemed off. Ryan stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He considered dismissing her concerns, as he had done earlier, but the weight in his chest stopped him. After a long pause, he replied, "Ryan, yeah, just thinking about it." The response felt inadequate, but it was all he could manage. He set the phone down and stared at the wall, his mind racing. Somewhere deep inside, a seed of doubt had been planted, and though he didn't know it yet, that doubt would grow into something far larger than he could imagine. The next morning, Joseph woke to a flood of notifications on his phone. Overnight, the woman who had filmed the encounter had posted the video online. It had already gone viral, shared thousands of times with captions like "Even the Attorney General isn't safe from profiling." The public outrage was immediate, with calls for an investigation into Officer Carter's actions and renewed demands for police reform. Joseph stared at the screen, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He hadn't planned for this, but now that it was out there, he knew he couldn't stay silent. The time for caution was over. It was time to act. Lines in the sand, approximately 2,000 words. The sun had barely risen when Joseph Malcolm's phone started buzzing incessantly, pulling him from a restless sleep. He rubbed his eyes and squinted at the screen. His inbox was flooded. Emails from reporters, messages from colleagues, and notifications about social media mentions. Overnight, the video of his traffic stop had taken on a life of its own, lighting up news feeds and sparking debates across the country. Joseph scrolled through the messages, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for any of this. The woman who had recorded the incident hadn't reached out to him directly, but her post had gone viral. In her caption, she had written, "If even the Attorney General isn't safe from racial profiling, what hope do the rest of us have?" The video itself was simple but damning. It showed Officer Carter's abrupt commands, Joseph's calm compliance, and the tension that simmered beneath the surface. The final moments, where Joseph's composed retort hinted at the absurdity of the situation, had struck a nerve with viewers. The comments were a mix of outrage and heartbreak. "This is why we need police reform. How many others are stopped without cameras to protect them? I can't believe this happened to the Attorney General." Joseph let out a slow breath, setting his phone down. He knew the video would make waves, but the intensity of the public reaction surprised even him. The incident was no longer just about him. It had become a symbol of the systemic issues he'd spent his career fighting against. Across town, Officer Ryan Carter was having a very different morning. He was sitting in the precinct's break room, his eyes fixed on the television mounted in the corner. The morning news was running the story, replaying the now infamous footage of his interaction with Joseph Malcolm. Ryan's stomach churned as he listened to the anchor's voice. The video has sparked outrage across social media, with many calling it a clear example of racial profiling. Attorney General Joseph Malcolm has not yet commented, but the public is demanding answers. The footage cut to clips of protests outside the precinct, signs reading, "Justice for all," and "Stop racial profiling." Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't expected this kind of backlash. To him, the stop had been routine. Suspicious vehicle, suspicious behavior. He'd followed his instincts, as he always did. But now, those instincts were under scrutiny, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped on a landmine. Laura Bennett walked into the room, her expression grim. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Ryan, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked. Ryan nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah." Laura leaned forward, lowering her voice. "This is bad, Ryan. Real bad. People are calling for an investigation, and the higher-ups are scrambling to figure out how to handle it." Ryan bristled. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was doing my job." Laura's eyes hardened. "Were you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you stopped him because of the car he was driving and the color of his skin." Ryan glared at her, his face reddening. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Laura shot back. "Ryan, we had no cause to stop him. Everything about that stop was wrong, and now it's blown up in our faces." Ryan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." Laura sighed, watching him storm out of the room. She wanted to believe that Ryan wasn't a bad cop, but his refusal to confront his biases was troubling. And now, it wasn't just his career on the line. It was the entire precinct's reputation. Meanwhile, Joseph was preparing for a press conference. His team had advised him to address the situation quickly, before the narrative spun out of control. Dressed in a sharp suit, he stood behind the podium, cameras flashing as reporters packed the room. He took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces before him. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the cause he represented. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but firm. "As many of you have seen, a video of my recent encounter with law enforcement has sparked significant discussion. While I respect the work of our police officers, this incident highlights a broader issue, one that affects countless people every day." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Racial profiling is a systemic problem, and it undermines trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This isn't just about one officer or one stop. It's about addressing the biases that permeate our system." The reporters peppered him with questions. "Do you believe the officer should be fired? Will you be filing a formal complaint? What message do you hope to send with your statement?" Joseph answered carefully, refusing to make the situation personal. "This isn't about retribution. It's about accountability and reform. My focus is on creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." As the conference wrapped up, Joseph felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had chosen his words carefully, but he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. At the precinct, Ryan was summoned to a meeting with Chief Wallace, a no-nonsense leader with decades of experience. The chief's office was a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside, calm, orderly, but heavy with unspoken tension. Ryan sat stiffly as Chief Wallace reviewed the case file, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set the folder down and looked at Ryan. "You've put us in a difficult position, Carter," the chief said bluntly. "The video doesn't look good, and the public is demanding answers." Ryan straightened in his chair. "I was doing my job, sir. I followed procedure." "Did you?" Wallace's sharp tone cut through the air. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you made a stop based on assumptions, not evidence. And now, we're all paying the price." Ryan clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "That's the problem, Carter," Wallace said, leaning forward. "You didn't think. And now we're facing an internal investigation, public protests, and a serious blow to community trust." The chief's words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he wasn't a bad cop, but the weight of the situation was crushing. For the first time, he began to question whether his instincts, those trusted gut feelings, had led him astray. As the days passed, the fallout from the incident continued to grow. Protests swelled in size, with activists demanding comprehensive police reform. The public debate grew louder, spilling onto talk shows, social media, and town hall meetings. Joseph found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant symbol of a movement he had long championed. He met with community leaders, lawmakers, and law enforcement officials, pushing for tangible change. But he also struggled with the personal toll. Late nights, constant scrutiny, and the weight of representing an issue so deeply rooted in the fabric of society. For Ryan, the fallout was equally intense. He was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, a move that only fueled his growing sense of isolation. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, wary of being associated with the controversy. Even Laura, his once loyal partner, seemed colder, her disappointment palpable. Both men were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their roles, and the system they represented. And as their lives continued to intersect in unexpected ways, the lines between right and wrong, justice and injustice, became increasingly blurred. Unbeknownst to them, their paths were set on a collision course that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and the world around them. The echoes of confrontation, approximately 2,000 words. Joseph Malcolm sat in a dimly lit conference room at the state capitol, flanked by key members of his advisory team. A stack of documents lay untouched on the polished oak table in front of him. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Outside, the noise of protests filtered through the thick glass windows, a low, persistent murmur of chants demanding justice and reform. Joseph rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his features. The past few weeks had been relentless, a whirlwind of press conferences, legislative meetings, and public appearances. The viral video of his traffic stop had thrust him into a spotlight brighter than any he had experienced before. While he had always been a public figure, this level of scrutiny was unprecedented. Mr. Attorney General, Angela Reyes, one of his most trusted advisors, broke the silence. The momentum is here. The protests, the media coverage, it's all pushing the conversation forward. But we need to act now before the public focus shifts. Joseph nodded slowly. I know, but this can't just be a band-aid solution. If we're going to propose reform, it has to be meaningful, not just performative. Angela slid a document across the table. This is the draft for the Community Accountability and Policing Reform Act. It includes increased funding for implicit bias training, mandatory use of body cameras, and the establishment of independent oversight committees to review cases of misconduct. Joseph picked up the document, scanning its contents. The proposals were sound, but they weren't revolutionary. He wanted more, something that would shake the foundations of the system, not just patch its cracks. It's a start, he said finally, setting the document down. But it's not enough. Angela leaned forward, her expression serious. What are you thinking? Joseph hesitated. He knew the risks of pushing too hard, too fast. But after his encounter with Officer Carter, and the countless stories he had heard from others who lacked the privilege of his platform, he couldn't ignore the urgency of the moment. I want to propose a statewide review of traffic stops, he said. Every department, every officer. We need to analyze patterns, identify disparities, and hold people accountable. Angela's eyes widened. That's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. Good, Joseph replied, his voice firm. It's time the system felt the pressure the people feel every day. Across town, Ryan Carter sat in his small apartment, staring blankly at the television. The sound was muted, but the images on the screen told the story clearly enough. Protesters marching through the streets, their signs bearing slogans like "End Profiling Now" and "Justice for All." Ryan's face appeared briefly in a montage of headlines, his name now synonymous with the controversy. He reached for the beer on the coffee table, but his hand stopped midair. Instead, he leaned back, letting out a heavy sigh. His suspension had left him with too much time to think. The internal investigation was still underway, and he had been instructed not to speak to the media. The silence was suffocating, forcing him to confront questions he had avoided for years. Was I wrong? He wondered for the 100th time. Had he misjudged the situation with Joseph Malcolm? The thought gnawed at him, but his pride refused to let him admit it fully. He had always believed in his instincts, in his ability to read people and situations. But now, Those instincts had put his career and the credibility of his department in jeopardy. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He stood slowly, his movements heavy, and opened the door to find Laura Bennett standing there. She looked tired, her usually sharp demeanor softened by weeks of tension. "Hey," she said simply. Ryan stepped aside, letting her in. Laura glanced around the cluttered living room before sitting on the edge of the couch. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're moving forward with the review," she said. "Every case you've been involved in is going to be scrutinized." Ryan's stomach sank. He had expected this, but hearing it aloud made it real. Laura continued, her tone measured. "You need to prepare yourself, Ryan. This isn't just about the Malcolm stop. They're going to dig into your entire record." Ryan sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly. "I'm not a racist, Laura," he said, his voice strained. "I've never set out to hurt anyone." "I believe you," Laura said gently. "But intent doesn't erase impact. You need to own what happened, Ryan. If you don't, this is going to destroy you." Ryan looked away, his jaw clenching. "How do I own something I don't fully understand?" Laura leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Start by listening. To the people who are angry, to the people who've been hurt. Stop defending yourself for a minute and try to see things from their perspective." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He knew Laura was right, but the thought of confronting his own biases terrified him. Admitting he was wrong felt like betraying the very core of his identity as a cop. The next day, Joseph attended a town hall meeting organized by community leaders. The event was held in a packed gymnasium, the air buzzing with energy and anticipation. People from all walks of life filled the space. Activists, students, parents, and even a few uniformed officers who sat in a quiet corner. Joseph took the stage, greeted by a standing ovation. He raised his hands to quiet the crowd, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. "Thank you for being here," he began. "This moment isn't just about me or my experience. It's about all of us, about creating a system where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." He spoke passionately about the need for reform, outlining his proposals and emphasizing the importance of community involvement. The audience responded with cheers and applause, their enthusiasm fueling his resolve. After his speech, Joseph opened the floor to questions. A young man in the front row stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Malcolm, what keeps you going? How do you stay hopeful when the system feels so broken?" Joseph paused, the weight of the question settling over him. He thought about his own struggles, the countless barriers he had faced as a black man in positions of power. He thought about his family, his community, and the people who had supported him along the way. "What keeps me going," he said finally, "is the belief that change is possible. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but every step we take brings us closer to the world we want to see. And moments like this, when we come together, when we demand better, they remind me that we're not alone in this fight." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. But amidst the positivity, Joseph noticed a figure standing near the back of the room. It was Officer Ryan Carter. Ryan had arrived late, slipping into the gymnasium unnoticed. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to come. Maybe it was Laura's words, or the gnawing guilt he couldn't shake. Whatever the reason, he stood silently, watching as Joseph Malcolm commanded the room with a mix of passion and poise. As the meeting ended and people began to disperse, Ryan found himself lingering. He didn't know what he wanted to say, or if he even had the right to approach Joseph. But before he could overthink it, Joseph spotted him. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded. Joseph's expression was unreadable, but he nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of Ryan's presence. Taking a deep breath, Ryan walked toward him. The tension between them was almost tangible as they stood face to face. "Mr. Malcolm," Ryan began, his voice hesitant, I wanted to apologize for what happened that night. Joseph regarded him carefully, his posture calm but guarded. "Do you understand why it was wrong?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Ryan hesitated. "I'm trying to," he admitted. "I know I messed up, and I know it's not just about me, but I want to do better." Joseph studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "That's a start." Ryan shook his hand, a small but significant gesture that marked the beginning of an uneasy but necessary dialogue. Neither man knew what lay ahead, but for the first time, they faced it together. Seeds of Change, approximately 2,000 words. The next morning, Joseph Malcolm sat in his office, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows behind him. His desk was cluttered with files, each representing a case of police misconduct or racial profiling. The video of his encounter with Officer Ryan Carter had become a rallying cry for reform, but Joseph knew the energy behind the movement wouldn't last forever. The public attention, however intense, was fickle, and the momentum could fade as quickly as it had begun. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Angela Reyes stepped inside, carrying a thick folder. "They approved the statewide review," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "But it wasn't easy. You've got a lot of resistance from the police unions." Joseph opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. The review would analyze traffic stops across the state, focusing on racial disparities and patterns of bias. It was the most comprehensive initiative of its kind, and Joseph knew it would face pushback at every level. "Let them resist," Joseph said firmly, closing the folder. "We're not doing this to make friends. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do." Angela nodded, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "What about Officer Carter?" she asked. "Have you decided how to handle his case?" Joseph exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. Ryan's apology at the town hall had been unexpected, and while Joseph appreciated the gesture, he wasn't sure if it was enough. The issue wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system that enabled and perpetuated behavior like his. "He's under investigation," Joseph said. "I'll let the process play out. But I think there's an opportunity here for him to learn, and maybe even to help others do the same." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about involving him in the reform efforts?" Joseph shrugged. "It's a possibility. If he's willing to own his mistakes and contribute to the solution, why not? Change has to start somewhere." Meanwhile, Ryan Carter was facing the harsh realities of his suspension. The internal investigation had uncovered no legal violations, but the department had issued a formal reprimand, citing his poor judgment during the stop. He had been ordered to attend mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and community relations, a move he initially resented but now saw as a chance to understand where he had gone wrong. His first training session was held in a nondescript conference room at the precinct. The facilitator, a soft-spoken professor named Dr. Elaine Brooks, began by presenting a series of case studies that highlighted the impact of racial profiling. The room was silent as she played audio recordings of people describing their experiences, stories of fear, humiliation, and anger. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The stories were hard to hear, but they resonated in a way he hadn't expected. He thought back to his own actions, the countless stops he had justified with vague feelings of suspicion. For the first time, he began to see those moments through the eyes of the people he had stopped. "Bias isn't always intentional," Dr. Brooks said, addressing the room. "But the impact is real, regardless of intent. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Ryan stayed after the session, waiting until the other attendees had left before approaching Dr. Brooks. "Dr. Brooks," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say thank you. That session, it made me realize some things I hadn't thought about before." Dr. Brooks smiled gently. "That's a good first step, Officer Carter. Acknowledging the problem is the only way to start fixing it." Ryan nodded, her words lingering in his mind as he left the building. As weeks turned into months, the tension between the police and the community remained high, but there were small signs of progress. Joseph's statewide review revealed alarming disparities in traffic stops, particularly involving Black and Latino drivers. The data was undeniable, forcing even the most resistant officials to acknowledge the need for change. At the same time, Ryan began volunteering with a local community organization that focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. He attended town halls, listening more than he spoke, and worked with youth programs to rebuild trust. It was slow, uncomfortable work, but it felt meaningful in a way his patrols hadn't in years. One evening, Ryan found himself at a community forum, seated beside Joseph Malcolm on a panel. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. The moderator introduced the panelists, outlining the purpose of the forum: to discuss the challenges and opportunities of police reform. Joseph spoke first, outlining the findings of the statewide review and the reforms his office was pursuing. He emphasized the importance of accountability, not just for individual officers but for the entire system. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, he cleared his throat, his palms sweating slightly. He looked out at the audience, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "I'm not here to defend what I did," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "What happened that night was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I'm also here because I want to be part of the solution." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For years, I thought my instincts were enough. I thought I could read people, situations without questioning my own biases. But I was wrong. And I've learned that it's not enough to just do your job. You have to do it in a way that respects and protects everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room was silent for a moment. Then a smattering of applause began, growing louder as more people joined in. Ryan glanced at Joseph, who nodded subtly, a hint of approval in his expression. After the forum, Joseph and Ryan stood outside the building, the crisp night air a welcome relief after the crowded room. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of the evening settling over them. "You did well," Joseph said finally, breaking the silence. Ryan shrugged. "I still have a lot to learn." "We all do," Joseph replied. "But the fact that you're willing to try, that matters." Ryan looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think the system can really change? Or are we just spinning our wheels?" Joseph considered the question carefully. "Change is hard," he said. "It's slow and it's messy. But I believe it's possible. Because if we stop believing that, what's the point?" Ryan nodded, the words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the system, but for himself. The seeds of change had been planted, and while the road ahead was uncertain, both men were committed to the journey. Their paths had crossed in a moment of conflict, but that moment had become the catalyst for something far greater, a movement that challenged the status quo and demanded better for everyone. A new foundation, approximately 2,000 words. Months had passed since the initial encounter between Attorney General Joseph Malcolm and Officer Ryan Carter, and while the public discourse around police reform had begun to settle into a steady rhythm, the work was far from over. Both men, shaped by the fallout of that fateful night, found themselves intertwined in the larger movement for systemic change. What had started as a contentious moment had evolved into a fragile but genuine alliance. The statewide review Joseph spearheaded had yielded striking results. The data revealed that Black and Latino drivers were disproportionately stopped and searched compared to their white counterparts, even when accounting for factors like location and time of day. The findings had ignited a new wave of public outcry, pushing lawmakers to act. Joseph had presented the findings in a landmark address to the state legislature, where he urged immediate action. "This is not just about numbers," he had said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Every data point represents a person, someone's son, daughter, parent, or neighbor, who has been subjected to unwarranted scrutiny simply because of the color of their skin. We cannot accept this as the status quo." His words had galvanized some lawmakers, but also sparked resistance from others. The police unions, in particular, were vehemently opposed to many of the proposed reforms, claiming they would tie officers' hands and make their jobs more dangerous. The debate was fierce, with protests and counter-protests outside the Capitol becoming a near-daily occurrence. On a rainy Friday afternoon, Joseph found himself back at the community center where the movement had first begun to take shape. This time, the room was filled with community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials, all gathered for a pivotal meeting to discuss the implementation of the Reform Act. Angela Reyes stood at the front of the room, her sharp voice cutting through the chatter. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame," she said. "We're here to build a framework that works for everyone. That means hard conversations and uncomfortable truths, but it also means collaboration." Joseph watched as the room divided itself. Officers clustered on one side, activists on the other. The tension was palpable, a microcosm of the larger societal divide they were trying to bridge. Ryan Carter sat quietly among the officers, his presence no longer the source of controversy it had once been. He had become a surprising advocate for reform, using his experiences to encourage his colleagues to approach their work with more empathy and self-awareness. When the floor was open for discussion, Ryan stood, drawing curious glances from both sides of the room. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but earnest. "Look, I'll be the first to admit that I was resistant to change," he said. "I thought I knew what I was doing, that my instincts were enough. But I've learned that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about protecting the people we serve, all of them." He looked directly at the activists across the room. "I'm not here to defend the mistakes I've made. I'm here to say that I want to do better, and I want my department to do better. We have to start somewhere. And I think this is it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though skepticism lingered in some faces. Joseph stood next, building on Ryan's comments. "Change doesn't come from one side alone," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. "It comes from all of us, law enforcement, community members, policymakers, working together to create a system that values fairness and justice above all else. That starts here, in this room, with this conversation." The meeting stretched late into the evening, the discussions often heated but ultimately productive. By the end, they had drafted a preliminary framework for implementing the reforms, including enhanced training programs, community oversight committees, and measures to track and address racial disparities in policing. The months that followed were a whirlwind of implementation. Training programs were rolled out across the state, teaching officers to recognize and address their implicit biases. Community oversight committees were established, giving residents a voice in the review of police practices. Departments were required to adopt body cameras, with strict guidelines for their use and transparency. Joseph worked tirelessly, balancing his responsibilities as Attorney General with his role as a public advocate for the reforms. He attended town halls, spoke at schools, and met with families affected by racial profiling, ensuring their stories were heard and their needs addressed. Ryan, meanwhile, became a key figure in the department's reform efforts. He helped lead the new training sessions, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale and a call to action. While some of his colleagues dismissed him as a sellout, others began to respect his commitment and bravery in confronting his own failings. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Ryan found himself sitting alone in the precinct's break room. He stared at the small plaque on the wall, a list of the department's core values: integrity, respect, service, excellence. For the first time in years, he felt he was truly living up to those ideals. The turning point came during a public ceremony to celebrate the passage of the Community Accountability and Policing Reform Act. Held on the steps of the state capitol, the event drew hundreds of attendees, from lawmakers and activists to everyday citizens who had been touched by the movement. Joseph took the stage, his presence commanding as he addressed the crowd. "This act is not the end of our journey," he said. "It's the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where accountability is not a buzzword but a guiding principle, where justice is not a privilege but a right. He paused, scanning the sea of faces. Change is never easy, and it's never fast. But it's possible. And together, we've proven that. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Ryan stood near the back of the crowd, watching silently. He felt a strange mix of pride and humility, knowing he had played a small role in this moment. As the applause died down, Joseph stepped off the stage and made his way through the crowd, eventually stopping in front of Ryan. "I didn't expect to see you here," Joseph said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Ryan shrugged. "Figured I should be. This is as much my responsibility as anyone's." Joseph nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Carter. And the work you're doing, it matters." Ryan met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks. Coming from you, that means a lot." The two men stood there for a moment, surrounded by the noise and energy of the crowd. They were unlikely allies, brought together by a moment of conflict, but united by a shared commitment to change. The reforms didn't solve everything. The work was ongoing, and there were setbacks and challenges at every turn. But the seeds of change had taken root, and a new foundation had been laid, one built on accountability, empathy, and a determination to create a more just society. For Joseph Malcolm and Ryan Carter, their journey was a testament to the power of confrontation, reflection, and ultimately, redemption. They had both been forced to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and their roles in the system, but in doing so, they had found a way forward, not just for themselves, but for the people they served.